doing World Communion Sunday with you, you may not know that what I like to do is emphasize a different nation or a different country or a different part of the world each year. And this year, as Cheryl and I were exploring what to do, El Salvador kept coming to the surface in a wide variety of ways. And so I am wearing this wonderful Salvadoran stole that Cheryl has loaned me. I loaned her my Guatemalan one. So several people have noticed and commented on Oscar Romero, the patron saint of El Salvador and one of the greatest Christians of our time. On the stole, we're using a wonderful Salvadoran chalice and plate during communion. We're even going to sing a little piece from the Salvadoran People's Mass. So it's a way of celebrating that. It is also the end of the season of creation, and we're celebrating the cosmos. And it was really cool to walk in and see this amazing banner that Karen Cranebetter created for us, I understand last year, I think. And to tie all of that in with that wonderful passage from Colossians that reminds us that somehow in Jesus, all of God gets rolled into one. All of God gets wrapped up in Jesus. Somehow in Jesus, things that don't make sense, things that are far beyond us, things that are, way out there, somehow come a little closer in Jesus. And it's a very, to use a strange word perhaps around Scripture, it's a very cosmic text, this passage from Colossians, because it really celebrates that we can find God in the presence of Christ, and we in turn can find the presence of Christ everywhere we turn, everywhere we look. So all of that makes me want to talk about St. Francis. Okay, slight shift there. Not much of a way. But it's the feast day of St. Francis this week. And St. Francis, interestingly, is often known for his love for creation. Most people, when you think of St. Francis, it's because you've seen him standing, usually with birds landing on him in some garden somewhere, right? That's his most popular spot to hang out these days. Which is kind of sad, because that's not all that he was about. Francis was, he'd probably cringe that I use this word, but Francis was one of the earliest very cosmic Christians. And Francis brought a number of pieces of theology into everyday life in ways that we benefit from and may not realize. And also, of course, we are living in what's a very exciting era in the ecumenical church. This is the time that we have a pope, leader of the Roman Catholic Church, who has dared to take the name of Francis as his name because he wishes to emulate much of the life of St. Francis. So St. Francis is one of those people I've always really admired, so indulge me, I want to talk about him for just a moment and see if I can remember how to tie all of this together. Francis was an interesting person. He was born in the late 1100s. We don't even know exactly when, but he was born in Assisi, and his first name was Pietro, or Peter. His father was a very wealthy businessman who did a lot of business in France, and Pietro was born while his father was in France on business, so when he came back, he gave him the nickname Francesco, which means person from France. And the name stuck, so that's the only name that he's really been known by throughout history. As I mentioned, his father was very wealthy. Francis grew up in a life of great luxury. His father sold fabric, and really nice, fancy fabric, and made a lot of money doing it. So Francis did what wealthy boys of his era did, and that was he became a soldier. Italy was not a country in those days. Italy was a bunch of city-states, and they fought with each other because it was fun. Now, yeah, I'm glad some of you are laughing. That, to me, is a really weird concept. But in those days, the wealthy men thought, boy, one of the fun things to do is go and see if we can kill the neighbors because we're better than them. And they would go to war frequently. It was a very, very common thing, and have fights, but they were fights that usually, several people died in. Francis did this, but he was absolutely stunned, just shaken to his foundation when he realized that these wars were causing hardship for others. He really saw them just as this big, tough, macho, guy thing, sort of like hockey. but with the actual, permission to kill people. Hockey comes almost that close and stops. So this is just one notch beyond the average hockey game. He saw it that way, and suddenly he realized people are starving because all of the money is going into these wars, and people are losing their homes, and people are losing where they live because we're conquering those cities and they have to move. And he was really stunned at how horrendous this was. Stories go, well, part of the problem with Francis is because he was a very humble person. Nobody was writing a lot of things about his life during his life or shortly afterwards, and then they started writing really glorious things to make him look really, really good. So historians struggle sometimes to find what they think is probably accurate. But it's believed that on his way back, he had to go through San Damiano, which was right near Assisi. And he was also horrified. There was a church there that had no roof. And Francis was absolutely horrified. How could the church, because he was used to going to a really nice, fancy building, etc., in Assisi. He thought, how can the church allow one of its buildings to fall into disrepair? That stunned him enough, but then he looked at it and he realized that a lot of people that were known as the discarded ones, people with disabilities, people with illnesses, people who lived in abject poverty, were living in the church at San Damiano. Even without a roof, it still provided a little bit of shelter. So he decided to do something about it. He decided he would do a fundraiser for the church at San Damiano. He took some of his father's fabric and he went to the market stall and he sold it, and all of the money that he made, he used to donate to folks to rebuild San Damiano Church. And his father was furious. His father beat him in public for wasting this money, for throwing this money away at poor people. And two things happened as a result of that. One of them was he never saw his father again, as far as we know. Two men never reconnected. But also Francis decided that what he would do was live his entire life as best as he could, trying to emulate Jesus. That the model for his life was to live in poverty, to live in humility, to try and do the things that Jesus would do. And that's what Francis became. And a lot of others joined him, and he formed an order which became the Franciscans. They still exist today. But it didn't stop there. And it's a fascinating enough story if it stopped there, just of, wow, this guy who really decided to go and help others. But he did something else. He was absolutely floored that people at San Damiano didn't understand why he was doing this. They kept saying to him, why are you being nice to us? Nobody else is ever nice to us. Why did you put a roof over our heads? Why are you going out collecting poor food for us? And why have you brought people in to help bandage our wounds and help us? Why would you do all this? And he said, well, it's because it's what Jesus would do. To which they all stared at him and said, Jesus would do this? Jesus the emperor? The emperor who lives in the big castle? Jesus who we should adore because he leads us into war against all those other horrible enemies? That Jesus would come and do this? And Francis was like, no! That's not the Jesus of the Bible. That's the Jesus that somebody has invented and taught you about. And so he began to teach biblical stories, realizing that these people were only given the stories that those in authority wanted them to have, and they wanted them to believe that Jesus was far away, very big, powerful, and mighty. Amongst other things, he staged the first Christmas pageant. The idea of staging the Christmas story began with St. Francis. He wanted to show these people this very simple story, that Jesus was born like them, was born in poverty. Ever since then, we've done that. We've lost the fact that for many centuries, doing a Christmas pageant was a very political act. A lot of churches would not permit it because it was really horrendous to be demonstrating that Jesus was born into poverty. The other thing that he did was to create the nativity set that many of us put up at Christmas time in our homes, so that everyone everywhere could put this up and remember, this is who Jesus is. Only they didn't just do them at Christmas time. He made these and suggested that people put it up in their house all the time, and as they walked past it, they would remember, Jesus is one of us. So again, I know it's a few months down the road, but when you're putting up a nativity scene this Christmas, I invite you to realize you're doing something very political. Because you're making a statement to the world, but most importantly just to yourselves, that Jesus is one of us. He's not far away, he's not mighty, he doesn't live in a castle. He's right here. That was so important for Francis. The other thing that was very important for him out of that was to recognize that Jesus is indeed in everything. And this is why I say he was wonderfully cosmic. Francis recognized that Christ was in everything. Thus, we should treat everything with respect, not just everybody, but everything. Duns Scotus, who was kind of a follower of Francis, although he lived several generations later and in Scotland, but was aware of some of the writings of Francis and some of his teaching, said, why would God only come as a person? Why would God not be present in everything in our world? And so that's a lesson that we take from Francis. It's a lesson that we celebrate as we think about God in the cosmos. It's a lesson we can think about as we celebrate communion, this very simple, basic meal, realizing that in the midst of everything else going on in his world, Jesus sat with his friends and said, whenever you do this, whenever you eat some bread, whenever you drink some wine or some juice, remember me. Remember that I am in you and with you and will be there always. I know we often celebrate St. Valentine's Day because we like to eat chocolate. We often celebrate St. Patrick's Day because we like to drink green beer. Ooh. Let us celebrate St. Francis Day on Tuesday. Let us do something that makes a little difference in our world, some act of justice, some random act of kindness, and think of Francis and the example that he left for us. Today is a huge day in the life of the church. We're doing all sorts of things, and I'm going to try and squeeze them all into a 2-minute sermon. No, okay. Maybe a little longer than 2 minutes, or else I'll have to talk really, really fast. But this is World Communion Sunday, and World Communion Sunday to me always has a very special power. It's kind of neat to think that while as Christians there are an awful lot of different groups and manifestations and permutations of us around the world, still we have some things in common that are much bigger than the things that divide us. And one of those is celebrating Holy Communion. We might do it in different ways, we might use different things, but there's something very powerful in remembering that time that Jesus spent with his disciples. And in that, remembering that no matter where we are, no matter what's going on, Jesus is with us. So we celebrate that this morning, and because this is my first time